From the KSL Broadcast House, this is Sunday Edition with Doug Wright.
Welcome to our program today. And rising interest rates, soaring prices, and still families struggling to find formula, including members of my own. These are some of the concerns facing Utahns across the state and people around the country, of course. On the program today, we're going to sit down with Zions Bank Senior Vice President and Economic and Public Policy Officer Robert Spendlove. We'll get his take. We'll talk about the rising interest rates, the economy, and how it's affecting all of us here in the state. But our first guest today is Utah's senior senator, Mike Lee, since 2011. Senator Lee, welcome to the program. I'm glad we could put this together.
Thank you, Doug. Good to be with you as always.
There's so many things we need to talk about and would like to talk about. I thought we could talk about the election a little later on in the program, but there are some huge national issues right now. We are at a 40-year high, and I'm old enough to remember the bad old days when you'd buy a home and it was like you were buying it on a credit card. It was incredible. And the effect that it had on the country in the waning days of the Jimmy Carter administration. Well, here we are again, 40-year high. What effect is this having on the country right now?
The effect it's having is devastating. And it's being felt everywhere. It's being felt especially strongly here in Utah. As the ranking Republican on the Joint Economic Committee, I've been able to compile some data on what inflation looks like month to month in every state in the union. Utah is one of the hardest states hit by this in terms of what it's done for the average family. Here in Utah, according to the most recent numbers that we updated just a few days ago, the average Utah family is spending an additional $800 a month every month on their basic household expenses, relative to just the beginning of 2021. It's a very significant climb, and it's a climb that really goes into a black hole. These are not luxury items people are buying. Yeah. It's not a new car. It's not a down payment on a home or on their child's college education. It's just going into the ether. This is the predictable, tragic result of government spending too much money, printing money that it doesn't have, and it ends up disproportionately impacting America's poor and middle class, especially families in Utah.
President Biden has often called part of the inflation, at least the Putin factor, or words to that effect. And, certainly the war in Ukraine and the issue with fuels and so on, but it's so much more than that. I'm looking right now, I heard a statistic this morning that talked about somebody's house payment. If you were to buy a house today versus a year ago, you'd be paying $500+ more on an average home. And as you gave us that statistic a moment ago, just between gas and rent and or house payment, that is almost an unfathomable chunk increase in 1 year.
It's an enormous amount of money. And, on the life of a mortgage on a home, that could end up being a six-figure sum, perhaps a substantial six-figure sum, depending on how high the interest rates rise. But this is where we are, and this is what happens. I understand the president's desire to blame it on Vladimir Putin. And certainly unforeseen circumstances in the world can contribute to inflation, but not nearly as much as his own policies have. This is a sort of a detail, a footnote to a footnote, the impact that Vladimir Putin and his war of aggression against Ukraine has had on it. Look, there can be no mistake the federal government did this under his watch by spending too much money that it doesn't have. This is what happens when you just print trillions of dollars.
Is there validity, and I've heard President Biden say this, and he said these guys, referring to you, Republicans and others, former President Trump, these guys are beating me up, but they raised the national debt by trillions of dollars as well. Is there validity to that?
Well, sure. Look, I've said for a long time that both political parties have had a hand in excessive spending. And excessive spending creates inflation because inflation is defined as too many dollars chasing too few goods. But there is a big difference between what happened still under Republican watch, under a Republican president at the outset of the pandemic, where there were some emergency expenditures made, and what happened at the beginning of the Biden administration. As the pandemic was exiting the phase where it was regarded as emergent, he stepped on the accelerator and he threw trillions of additional dollars at it. And that is what caused this dramatic spike in inflation.
Here we are in June, and that's always an interesting time for the Supreme Court of the United States. You've had experience in the court, clerking for Justice Alito. And you and I were talking about this before going on the air. I was back there in Washington in 2015 when the decisions came down on gay marriage issues. I was there doing a live broadcast from the Capitol lawn, and it was just open. And people were protesting and cheering on the steps and everything. There were crowds, some pretty colorful folks, but overall, now I'm seeing fences around the Supreme Court. I can't tell you, Senator, how much that distresses me.
I've been visiting the Supreme Court for 42 years. Started watching Supreme Court arguments at the age of 10, long story, but worked there for a while. I've worked on cases argued there. I have never seen this kind of security around the court. And you know, Doug, they've got 2 layers of perimeter fencing now. One is the high fencing that's very difficult to climb. Then there's another layer of temporary fencing that's just there to create a police line. This is reflective of a sense that there is going to be an attempt to break into, perhaps to burn or otherwise harm the building itself and the justices inside. Yeah. This is not the kind of America that we've seen in the past. I've never seen the court dealing with that, and there's been an attempt to demonize, delegitimize, and isolate those justices inclined to support the majority opinion in the Dobbs case.
You know, on one hand, you go, okay, is this an overreaction? But what we saw on January 6th, you know, was so startling. I've mentioned this before. I've been around a long time now. I've seen everything. The first thing that just shocked me to my core was the death of President Kennedy, all of the assassinations of the 1960s, Watergate, everything, the Twin Towers coming down. I mean, you name it, Vietnam. I don't think I was ever so distressed in my life about our country, who we are, what we are, where we're going, than when I saw the assault on the Capitol. And, you know, things are underway right now, and I'm throwing you kind of an interesting question here for the last of this segment. But as you look back on the 6th of January, I mean, President Roosevelt would have called it a date that will live in infamy. Yeah. And it was us, not them, that did it. How are we handling that? Have we fully appreciated? There are still apologists for it that call it just kind of a glorious tourist day.
Yeah. It was sad, it was tragic, it was unfortunate, and it was avoidable. And so I think the country at that moment learned a very sad lesson about the fact that you can't tinker with the machinery in that way. You can't tinker with strong emotions, and we've got to be very careful to make sure that people understand where lines are and that certain lines can never be crossed.
There's so many things that we would love to talk about, and certainly the election. There's a little minor detail of a primary coming up here pretty quick. So we'll talk about that and more as we continue our conversation with our senior senator here in the state of Utah, Mike Lee. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Sunday Edition. We're very pleased to have Utah Senior Senator Mike Lee with us, and we've talked about some of the national issues, but of course there's a little election that is coming up here in the state of Utah, and it's the Republican primary, not to mention the general election that will be around the corner as well. I think of this election, and honestly, it's unprecedented on a lot of levels. From the national perspective, the influence of former President Donald Trump and how many people are kind of wary and playing that card and everything else, either to their benefit or detriment, depending on your point of view. Has that trickled into Utah at all? Is there a looming presence of former President Donald Trump, because he fared fairly well in the state?
Yeah, you know, I think he did, and I also think Utah has always been a state that looks at a complete picture, at a complete package, and Utah Republicans in particular are very much about identifying certain principles that they stand for, identifying principles like free markets and civil society, the importance of defending the Constitution, and that's why Utah Republicans tend not to become fixated with a particular personality as much as they remain focused on why they're Republicans.
Yeah. Again, in off-air discussions, I I always think back to what is carved over the mantle in the White House that came from John Adams and President Kennedy, basically praying that good and decent, honorable people, I'm paraphrasing here, will reside under this roof. And I sometimes get concerned because character, in my opinion, I'm just that old-fashioned senator, character matters. And I'm all for the great policies and everything else. And I guess I'm still amazed at the influence that President Trump, former President Trump, still has, especially over the Republican Party. It honestly surprises me.
Yeah. Look, with every president of the United States, every president who I've studied has some layers of complexity. And that's certainly the case with him, possibly even more with him than with others. I think there is some nostalgia for the time in which he served as president, in part because of good things that happened while he was president, good things that he did. In every era, there are decisions that are made that can be praised and those that are less praiseworthy. Yeah. And I think he is certainly no exception in that regard.
There are other issues that I want to talk about really quickly, but I've often wondered, I've read a lot of the books, pro and con, on the former president. I kind of make that a hobby. And it's amazing how many people that went to the wall for him, he turns on, including you, including Mike Pence, including so many others. And in the recent hearings, and everybody has their opinion about the committee, but even family members don't fare well.
Yeah, the Mike Pence moment on January 6th was particularly surprising to me. Mike Pence is someone who had been very loyal to him. The two of them had been very close for the entirety of the previous 4 years. It was not something I expected.
Yeah. Let's talk about the election here. And, the Trump factor is fascinating as we look at this midterm election all around the country. But here in the state of Utah, I've used this term several times in interviewing several people, including the Republican chair and others, about kind of the unprecedented nature of your race, where, they're a Republican challenge. Those individuals did not fare well in the convention. They're faring better in open general polls among potential voters or registered voters in the state of Utah. But to not have a Democratic candidate, I have to go clear back to the time of Chris Cannon, when somebody running for a federal office ran unopposed, fundamentally. Right. How unprecedented is that? And are you surprised that the Democratic Party basically has put their support behind Evan McMullin? Yes,
I was surprised they didn't choose to run their own candidate. There was a prominent Democrat who had previously run for Congress, who was ready to run, who had filed. I was surprised when the Democratic Party chose not to field a candidate at all. But the Democratic Party nonetheless made a decision to make Evan McMullin their candidate. Even though he is running as an independent, he has been endorsed by the Utah Democratic Party. And yes, that was very surprising and is also pretty unprecedented, as far as I'm aware, in modern Utah history, of a prominent statewide race in which the Democrats just choose not to field a candidate.
The Republican primary, if you do look at the polls and believe the polls, Ali Isom and Becky Edwards seem not to have much of a chance of defeating you, let's put it that way, in the Republican primary. What are you anticipating with the general election, with something that is so unprecedented? And even I see it in you, I felt it, the surprise of this, and especially the action of the Democratic Party.
It's a surprise, and I think that surprise is going to lead to a lot of questions being asked about policy issues, and that's, of course, where any campaign should be. In this campaign, as in any other, with or without a Democratic opponent, that's what I would be focusing on. People are going to want to know where he stands on issues important to Utahns, where he stands on issues that could create inflation, where he stands on the protection of the sanctity of unborn human life, for example. Those will all be important questions that will be asked. And some of Evan McMullin's positions have changed. When he ran for president in 2016, he ran as aggressively pro-life. He criticized then-candidate Donald Trump for being insufficiently pro-life. He's now flipped that position. And so I think those questions will come out and they'll be brought to bear.
One final question, and this really has a lot to do with you and Evan McMullin, but seems to be, at least it's supposed to be, out of your hands. The money that is going to flow into our great state, and I'm hearing people make estimates that are almost mind-boggling. The money that will come in from Club for Growth, and I could go through the list. As we know, when Senator Hatch ran the last time, the majority of his money was fighting the negative advertisements and tenure of the campaign from outside. What are you anticipating in this race of yours?
You know, some of it will depend on exactly how close the race appears to be by then. But yeah, it's a feature of modern politics, a rather unfortunate one, that as we've nationalized so many things, as so many political questions have now become federal, national political questions. Every race in every state is important to people of that party in every other state. And so money comes pouring in, and yeah, that very often means that kind of advertising.
Many of us who have traveled around the country, and we've been there for primaries and so on, you see the airwaves just plastered. You cannot even see a quote-unquote normal commercial to buy an automobile or a refrigerator. I'm wondering if it's going to be like that this time.
I sure hope not. Sure hope not. But who knows?
Yeah.
That's beyond my control.
Senator Lee, I know you've had a busy schedule. We were talking about some of the things coming up in your family. I really appreciate you making time for us here on Sunday Edition.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you for joining us. And we will be right back with Robert Spendlove. And welcome back to Sunday Edition. We're very pleased to have the Senior Vice President and Economic and Public Policy Officer with Zions Bank joining us, Robert Spendlove, who is also a representative here in the state of Utah. Always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, happy to do it. Good to be with you, Doug.
We talked earlier with Senator Lee, kind of in broad terms, about the effect of inflation and the interest rate going up and the overall economics of the country right now. But I thought with you we could get really specific about Utah. I remember, this was years ago, when President Bush, George W. Bush, was here, and he was just praising Utah because we were under 3% when it comes to unemployment. And I can remember some of the experts at that time saying, you know, at a certain point, there just isn't enough to kind of people available to keep the wheels of business turning without grinding. And now we've been at 1.9%. There's also now, I think, 2% right now?
2%, yep.
What does that mean for the state of Utah?
So, you know, that's one of the struggles is, you know, inflation is a sign of an overheating economy. And that's what we've been seeing in our nation for the last year. And, you know, at the national level, the unemployment is 3.6%. In Utah, we're way below that at 2%. Yeah. And, you know, it just becomes very difficult. You see the signs of the labor shortages if you go out to a restaurant or if you go to, you know, the grocery store. They're all struggling to kind of operate because there's no one available to work.
It's amazing how many times I'll walk up to a business that I'm familiar with. There's a 7-Eleven that I quite often will hit for a Diet Coke on the way home, and it's right at the freeway entrance. And I pulled in there the other day, and I looked up. There was a sign on the door, and it was padlocked. And they said, due to the fact that we cannot get people to work, we are temporarily closed. You know, those are things that I've never seen. Favorite restaurants, they say we're now choosing to close on Monday because we want to give you good service. If we spread it out over 6 or 7 days, we can't give you good service. How unprecedented is this?
You know, it is the lowest unemployment that the state of Utah has ever seen. We've never had 1.9% unemployment before. And the reason why it's so bad is it really can be destructive for these businesses. Yeah. You know, imagine if you run like a small business, a food truck, and you can't get employees. You know, you still have your bills, you still have your fixed costs.
That's right.
Eventually, that labor shortage can kill businesses. And that's where that very low unemployment rate can be destructive to the economy.
We add that additional layer, and you've already alluded to it, that now, and as I was talking with Senator Lee, I've been around long enough, I remember that inflation in the late 1970s and the tail end of the Carter years and even into the Reagan years. And oh my goodness, you know, when you felt like you were putting major expenses, like buying a house, on a 18% credit card. It felt like that. How damaging is that on top of what you'd think is a wonderful thing, relatively low unemployment?
Yeah, and and this is the struggle. So the Federal Reserve has been very nervous about this, and it essentially goes back to, again, this inflation. The inflation is very destructive. The Fed thought it would go away on its own, but it didn't, and it just kept going up and up. And then in the most recent inflation report, they thought it had peaked, and it kept going up. So that's where the Fed said, we've got to get a handle on it, and they're going extra aggressive on interest rates. Their goal is to slow down that inflation, but the downside is it will also slow the economy. And so they're essentially saying, okay, everything, the financing costs of everything is going to be higher now, so we can get those prices to come down.
I know it's hard to ask people to look in the crystal ball, but there's a lot of prognostication that needs to go on when you're an economist. What are you anticipating? What is the Fed signaling? There will be more interest rate increases, won't there?
Yes, there will. So a year ago, interest rates were at zero. Right now, the federal funds rate, which is the shortest term.
That still seems unbelievable to me.
Yeah. Now they're playing catch up. So it's at 1.5%. They've also signaled that a year from now, they'll be 2% higher than they are right now. So if you think about the Fed as driving a car, a year ago, they just, they were hitting the gas, pedal to the metal. Now what they've done is they've shifted over and they're hitting the brakes really hard with these higher rates. There is a fear. The Fed is trying to orchestrate a soft landing. They're trying to slow growth without causing a recession. But there is a real fear that they will actually cause a recession. And while a recession is bad, the runaway inflation is worse.
Yeah, we have just a couple of seconds. Is there a word of hope for some of the people that are going, good grief, how do I cope with this? And I've only got about 30 seconds.
The good thing is we're in Utah. Utah has always done very well in recessions. In the last recession, we emerged as the strongest state in the country. I continue to have very good confidence about our state and about our economy.
Robert Spendlove, always a pleasure to have you on Sunday Edition.
It's great to see you.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. And that does it for our program today. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next week on Music, and the spoken word is coming up next.